The auctioneer's hand landed on Lydia's shoulder like a branding iron, spinning her to face the crowd before she could catch her breath. She was still bleeding. The baby in her arms had been alive for less than 2 hours, and the man who had called himself her owner for the past 3 years was standing at the edge of the platform with a ledger book open, tallying her debts like she was a broken piece of equipment he'd finally decided to offload. $200, he called out. Young, strong, and she just proved she can breed. Comes with the infant. Take both or leave both. Laughter rippled through the crowd. Lydia did not cry. She had run out of tears somewhere around the 7th month when she realized that no one was coming for her. If you've ever felt invisible, like the world looked right through you and kept walking, then you already know exactly how Lydia felt standing on that platform. The question is, what would you have done next? Don't answer yet. Stay with her. If this story already has your heart pounding, hit that like button right now. Drop your city or country in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. And subscribe so you don't miss what happens next. Because I promise you, what that crowd witnessed in the next 60 seconds changed every single one of their lives, including the quiet man standing in the back who hadn't said a word yet. The morning had started the way most mornings started for Lydia, with someone else deciding what she would do with her body and her time. Her name was Lydia Vane, though nobody had called her by that name in so long that it had started to feel like something she'd read in a book once and half remembered. The man who owned the cattle yard outside Harlan Creek, Texas, called her Girl. The other workers called her nothing at all, and the men who passed through on trail drives looked at her the way they looked at the horses, assessing, calculating, occasionally patting her arm without asking. She was 19 years old. She had been sold the first time at 15, after her stepfather's gambling debts came due and the creditor accepted a trade. She'd tried twice to run. The first time, a sheriff 2 counties over had returned her before sundown. The second time, she'd made it nearly 40 miles before her shoes gave out on a rocky stretch of river bottom, and she'd been too proud to beg for help from the farmhouse she passed, the one with laundry on the line and children playing in the yard, the kind of ordinary life that felt like a foreign country to her. She'd been brought back that second time with a rope around her wrists, and after that she'd stopped running. Not because she'd given up, though she'd told herself she had, but because she'd started to understand that the problem wasn't geography. The problem was that in the eyes of every legal document, every deed, every transaction record in Harlan Creek, Texas, she did not exist as a person. She existed as property. And property didn't have feet you could follow. Property had a value written in ink. The baby had come fast, the way second labor sometimes did. Not that anyone in that yard knew or cared that Lydia had lost a child before. A boy who'd arrived too early and too quiet 17 months ago, in the back of a supply wagon in the middle of a rainstorm. She'd buried him herself. She'd set his name into the dirt, and she'd gotten up and walked back to the yard because there was nowhere else to go. This one came on a Tuesday morning in early March, with the temperature barely above freezing and the ground still hard from the previous night's frost. Lydia had been hauling water buckets when the first real contraction hit. She'd set the buckets down, picked them back up, set them down again when the second one came. A woman named Dottie, who worked the cook fires, noticed and steered her toward an empty stall in the far end of the barn without saying anything to the men. Dottie didn't ask permission. She'd learned long ago that asking permission for small acts of mercy was just a faster way to get them denied. The baby was born on a pile of hay with Dottie's apron beneath her and no doctor within 10 miles. She came out screaming, which was the first good sign Lydia had experienced in longer than she could account for. Lydia held her against her chest and felt something she had not permitted herself to feel in years. Something that sat in the middle of her ribcage like a coal that hadn't quite gone cold. She named her Clara. Quietly. Just to herself. She had maybe 90 minutes with that feeling before Holt showed up. Warren Holt was the man who owned the cattle yard, and when people in Harlan Creek described him, they used words like practical and no nonsense, which were the words people used when they didn't want to say the real word. He was 53 years old, thick through the chest, with hands that were always a little dirty, no matter how recently he'd washed them. He wasn't a man who yelled often because he'd learned early that quiet delivered the same message with less effort. He stood in the doorway of that barn stall and looked at Lydia and the baby for exactly 4 seconds before he spoke. "Get her up," he said to Dottie. "I've got buyers at the main yard." Dottie's whole body went rigid. "Warren, she's been delivered less than 2 hours. "I didn't ask for a count." He looked at Lydia directly then, the way he looked at livestock he was about to move. "On your feet, you can carry it." The "it" landed somewhere behind Lydia's eyes. She felt it like a slap, and then she felt something else underneath the slap. A hard, cold anger that she recognized as the last truly useful thing she owned. She got to her feet because refusing would accomplish nothing except making Dottie suffer alongside her, and she'd done enough harm to enough women who'd tried to be kind to her. She carried Clara across the yard with her arms shaking and her knees threatening to buckle on every third step. The frost had come back in the night, and the mud between the stalls had refrozen into ridged, uneven ground that caught at her feet. She focused on the baby's warmth against her chest. She focused on that one point of heat. The main yard was already crowded with men when she arrived. This was how it worked in Harlan Creek, in those years when the law had a lot of words about what was and wasn't permitted, and very little interest in enforcing the ones that inconvenienced men like Holt. There was a platform at the edge of the yard, a low wooden stage that had been built for livestock presentations, and had over the years been used for a range of transactions that never showed up in any official records. Men gathered, money changed hands, things moved from one ownership to another. Lydia had watched it happen 3 times from the edge of the yard. She had never expected to be on it. Holt had her standing on the platform before she fully understood what was happening. He made his announcement in a flat, businesslike tone, the same tone he used when he was selling yearling calves. He listed her age, her health, her capacity for physical labor. He mentioned the baby last, as an afterthought, the way you might mention a piece of furniture that came with the house. $200, young, strong, and she just proved she can breed, comes with the infant, take both or leave both. The laughter hit her like cold water. There were maybe 30 men in that yard, some she recognized, neighboring ranchers, a feed supplier, a man who ran a dry goods operation 2 towns over. Some she didn't know. They all had the same expression, the look of men at a market, evaluating, deciding whether the price was right. Lydia stood straighter. She didn't know why she did it. It wasn't a decision, exactly. It was more like the last available form of resistance. If she was going to be looked at, she was going to be looked at standing up. She tucked Clara tighter against her chest, and she raised her chin and she looked back at them. Not with defiance. She didn't have the energy for defiance. She looked back at them with something closer to exhaustion, with the specific, worn-down dignity of a person who has been diminished so many times that diminishment has stopped feeling like a surprise. A man near the front made an offer. $80 structured as a work contract. Holt shook his head. Another man offered $100 in a trade. Holt shook his head again. The bidding was slow and quiet, which was worse somehow than if it had been loud. Loud would have felt like something. This was just business, just arithmetic, just the specific grinding indignity of being calculated. That was when the voice came from the back. 300. It cut through the arithmetic like a blade through cloth. Lydia turned. Most of the men turned. The voice had come from a man who had apparently been there the whole time, leaning against the fence post at the far edge of the yard, arms folded, hat pulled low. He was tall, somewhere in his mid-30s, with the kind of stillness that didn't come from laziness. He hadn't moved to enter the crowd. He hadn't called out to announce himself. He had simply waited until he had something to say and then said it. Holt squinted. 300 for the girl and the infant? 300 for both, the man said. Paid now, today, cash. Murmuring moved through the crowd. 300 was considerably more than the standing price for this kind of transaction, and everyone in that yard understood what it meant when someone significantly overpaid. It meant they wanted this concluded quickly, without argument, without anyone feeling clever enough to continue bidding. Holt looked at the man for a moment, then at Lydia, then back at the man. He was not a sentimental person, but he was practical, and the offer was real money. Done, he said. That single word closed the only life Lydia had known for 4 years. She watched the transaction happen from the platform. The man walking forward through the parted crowd with a calm that struck her as strange, almost wrong, because nobody moved through this kind of space with calm unless they owned it. He counted out the bills in front of Holt with the steady hands of someone who'd handled large amounts of money enough that it had stopped meaning anything to him beyond its function. Holt pocketed the money without looking at Lydia again. Just like that, she was no longer his problem. The man looked up at her from the base of the platform. He was close enough now that she could see his face clearly, a face that had been outside in all kinds of weather for most of its life, with lines at the corners of his eyes and a jaw that looked like it had been set firmly and left that way. He was not a soft man, but there was something in the way he looked at her that was different. He wasn't evaluating, he wasn't calculating. He was looking at her the way you look at something that's wrong, at a situation that shouldn't exist and does. "Can you walk?" he asked. The question startled her. It was so ordinary, so human. "Yes," she said. "My wagon's at the road. Take your time with the steps." He turned and walked ahead of her and did not reach out to take her arm or her elbow or steer her in any direction. He simply walked, and she followed, because there was nothing else left to follow, and because Clara was starting to fuss against her chest, and Lydia needed somewhere to sit down before her legs made the decision for her. Nobody in the yard said anything as she stepped down from the platform and crossed the frozen mud. She felt their eyes on her back the whole way. She expected to feel shame. She'd felt it so many times in that yard that she'd almost forgotten it had another name. Instead, all she felt was the cold, and Clara's warmth against it, and a strange, formless sensation in her chest that she couldn't name yet because she hadn't felt it in long enough that she'd forgotten what it was called. It was the feeling of motion, of direction, of one foot in front of the other towards something that was not yet visible but was, at minimum, somewhere other than here. She didn't know the man's name. She didn't know where his wagon was going. She didn't know what he wanted or what $300 meant to him or what he expected in return. She knew only one thing with complete certainty as she walked through that gate and away from Warren Holt's cattle yard for the last time. She would not survive another year in a place like that. And Clara would not survive it at all. Whatever came next, whatever the man at the fence post had paid for, whatever arrangement she was now part of, it could not be worse than what she was walking away from. She was wrong about that in some ways. There were things ahead that would test her in ways she couldn't anticipate from the frozen mud of that yard. But she was right about one thing. She never walked through that gate again. The wagon was where he said it was. A solid, plain, unremarkable wagon with a single horse that had the patient look of an animal that had been well fed and not worked beyond its strength. The man untied the horse without ceremony and climbed to the bench and waited. Lydia pulled herself up to the seat, clutched Clara with one arm and the bench edge with the other, and they moved. Neither of them spoke for a long time. The road out of Harlan Creek went northwest, into country that got hillier and quieter the further you went. Lydia watched the town fall away behind them. The feed store, the water tower, the livery where she'd once hidden under a pile of saddle blankets for 6 hours before they found her. And she kept waiting for the particular kind of dread she'd learned to feel whenever a situation was about to become a different kind of bad. It didn't come. Or rather, it came and sat beside her and couldn't quite find a foothold, because the man beside her wasn't doing any of the things she'd learned to brace for. He wasn't asking questions. He wasn't explaining what was going to happen and what she was expected to do about it. He wasn't positioned in a way that blocked her from the edge of the wagon. After about 4 miles of silence, he spoke. "My name is Caleb Whitlock. I run a cattle operation about 11 miles north of here. The cabin's not much. It'll be cold tonight." He paused. "You should know that I didn't do what I did back there because I think I own you. I don't. What I did back there was buy you out of a situation that had no other exit, and the money is gone, and I don't expect it back. And when we get to the ranch, I'll explain what I'm offering, and you can tell me what you want to do with it." Lydia held very still. "What are you offering?" "A room. Work, if you want it. Protection while you get back on your feet. Nobody giving orders." He glanced at Clara briefly, then back at the road. "And whatever that little one needs. I've got supplies. She'll be fed." The simplicity of it made her suspicious in a way that generosity always had. Generous people in Lydia's experience were either collecting a debt or performing something for an audience. There was no audience on this road. There was no debt she could identify. "Why?" she asked. He didn't answer right away. The horse moved steadily up a low rise, and the wind came in from the northwest, carrying the smell of grass and cold earth. "I had a sister," he said finally. "Younger than me by 7 years, she got into a situation not too different from yours when she was 16. He was quiet for a moment. "I wasn't there. I should have been. I wasn't." He didn't elaborate. He didn't reach for more words. He said what was true and let it sit, and Lydia understood that this was not a performance. This was a man who had carried something heavy for a long time and wasn't interested in making it sound poetic. She looked down at Clara. Clara's eyes were closed, her tiny face pressed against Lydia's coat, completely unaware that she had already survived the worst hour of her very short life. "Lydia," she said. "My name is Lydia Vane." The man nodded once, as if filing it away. "Clara," she added, looking at the baby. "Good names," he said. And then they were both quiet again, moving north through the cold Texas morning toward a life that neither of them could fully imagine yet, with a sky overhead that was just beginning to clear at the edges, gray pulling back from blue in the way that mornings sometimes did when they weren't trying to make a point of it, just quietly, stubbornly insisting on beginning. The cabin was smaller than Lydia had imagined and colder than Caleb had warned. It sat at the end of a dirt track that wound between two low hills and came out into a clearing that felt less like an arrival and more like a place the world had simply stopped paying attention to. The structure itself was solid, logs fitted tight, a stone chimney, a porch that sagged on the left side but held. And there was a barn 20 yards off, and a fenced pasture beyond that, with maybe 40 head of cattle standing in the fading afternoon light, their breath rising in small clouds. It was not a prosperous ranch. It was a surviving one. There was a difference, and Lydia had learned to read it. Caleb pulled the wagon up to the porch and climbed down and tied the horse without rushing. Lydia didn't wait for help. She stepped down on her own, which was a mistake. Her legs had stiffened during the ride, and the drop sent a sharp complaint up through her hips and lower back that she swallowed without making a sound. She adjusted Clara against her chest and stood in the thin March light and looked at the cabin door. "Fire's been banked," Caleb said from behind her. "Should come up fast once I open the damper. There's food in the box. Nothing fancy. Cornbread from 2 days ago, salt pork, some dried beans I can put on." He moved past her to the door, not in front of her, beside her, and opened it and stepped back. "Go on in. I'll see to the horse." She went in. The cabin was one main room with a sleeping loft above and a small lean-to addition off the back that turned out to be a washroom of sorts. A wooden tub, a hand pump that fed from a cistern, a shelf with soap, and a folded cloth. The main room had a table, 2 chairs, a cook stove in one corner, and a fireplace on the far wall with the banked coals still glowing orange-red at the bottom. There was one bed, pushed into the corner near the fireplace, with a wool blanket folded across the foot of it. The loft had a rope ladder and what looked like a pallet up there, though she couldn't see it clearly from the floor. She sat down in one of the chairs because her body stopped giving her options. Clara had fallen asleep during the ride and stayed asleep now, her face pressed against the front of Lydia's coat. Lydia looked at her, really looked at her for the first time since the barn, without the crowd and the cold and Holt's flat voice pressing in from every direction. She was small, smaller than the boy had been. Her fingers were curled loosely under her chin, and she had a patch of dark hair above her left ear that was already trying to wave in a direction it apparently preferred. Lydia put 2 fingers against the baby's cheek just to confirm the warmth was still there. It was. She let herself exhale. Caleb came in 20 minutes later, stamping mud from his boots on the porch before entering, a detail Lydia noticed because it was the kind of detail that said something about a man. The way he behaved when he thought only the walls were watching. He crossed to the fireplace and opened the damper and added 2 logs, and the fire caught and climbed almost immediately, filling the room with the smell of burning pine and the first real heat she'd felt since the barn. He set a pot of water on the stove without speaking. Then he moved to the supply box and came back with a cloth-wrapped piece of cornbread and set it on the table in front of her. "Eat that first," he said. "The beans will take a while." "I'm not hungry." "I know. Eat it anyway." She looked at him. He was already moving back toward the stove, not watching her, not waiting to see if she'd comply, not giving her an order and standing over it, just stating a fact and moving on. She ate the cornbread. It was dry and 2 days old, and it tasted like the best thing she'd eaten in months. The evening passed in a strange underwater quiet that Lydia didn't know how to be inside of. Caleb cooked the beans with salt pork and a dried onion. He brought a bowl to the table without ceremony and set a spoon beside it and poured water from the pot into a tin cup and set that beside the bowl, and then sat down in the other chair with his own bowl and ate in silence. Lydia ate too. Clara slept through dinner tied into a kind of sling Lydia had fashioned from her scarf pressed against her front, leaving both hands mostly free. At some point, because the silence had gone on long enough that filling it felt less frightening than letting it continue, Lydia asked the question she'd been turning over since the wagon. "What do you actually need from me?" Caleb set his spoon down. He didn't seem surprised by the question. "Right now? Nothing." "That's not an answer. It's the only honest one I've got tonight." He looked at her directly, the way he'd looked at her from the base of the auction platform. Not calculating, not soft, just level. "I've got a ranch I'm running alone. There's more work than one person can do well. If you're willing to work, there's room for that arrangement. But not tonight, and not until you're ready. I'm not going to hand you a list. And if I decide to leave, then you leave. I'll give you what supplies I can manage and point you toward the nearest town with a telegraph and whatever money I've got that isn't already spoken for." He picked his spoon back up. "I'm not keeping you here. I want to be very plain about that." Lydia watched him eat. "Most men say things like that," she said carefully, "and then they don't mean them." "I know. So why should I believe you?" He considered this for a moment, chewing, swallowing. "You probably shouldn't yet. That's a fair position." He set the empty bowl aside. "But I'll tell you this much. I've got no wife, no family within 400 miles, nobody who comes to this ranch who I didn't invite. I'm not performing anything for an audience. There's no one here to impress." He stood and carried his bowl to the wash basin. "You can sleep in the bed. I'll be on the floor near the fire. The loft's too cold tonight." She opened her mouth to protest, out of habit, because somewhere in the last 4 years she'd learned that objecting to arrangements was sometimes the safer move, that acquiescence could be read as invitation. And then she stopped, because he had already moved away. He was washing his bowl. He had said what he said, and that was apparently the end of it. She slept in the bed. She did not sleep well, but she slept, which was already more than she'd managed in longer than she could account for. She woke twice, once when Clara needed feeding, once when the fire crackled loud enough to pull her out of a dream she didn't remember. And both times she found the room still and Caleb a shape on the floor near the hearth, turned away from her, breathing slow. He never stirred. Or if he did, he had the decency to do it quietly. The next morning was worse than the night, which was usually how it went. The night was survival. The morning was reckoning. Lydia woke to gray light, and Clara fussing, and the particular weight in her body that came not from exhaustion, but from the accumulated pressure of not having cried in longer than was probably healthy. She got up and fed the baby and stood at the small window above the bed and looked out at the frost on the grass and the cattle moving slow in the pasture, and the smoke rising from the chimney of the barn, where Caleb was apparently already working, and she felt the full weight of where she was and what had happened settle across her shoulders like something she would be carrying for a very long time. She didn't cry. She wanted to. She stood at that window and held Clara and breathed through it, because crying was a luxury she'd never quite been able to afford, and some habits were harder to break than others. She made herself useful instead. That was the other habit, the one she'd developed not because anyone had required it, but because usefulness was the closest thing to safety she'd ever found. If you were doing something necessary, people left you alone. If you were occupied and competent and not requiring anything from anyone, the cost of bothering you outweighed the benefit, and you got left alone. And being left alone was the closest thing to peace available. She found flour and salt and lard in the supply box and made biscuits. She was not a skilled cook. She'd done it enough to be functional and not much more. But the biscuits came out of the oven looking like biscuits, which was sufficient. She found a coffee tin and got a pot going on the stove. She swept the floor, which needed it. She found a split in one of the window shutters that was letting in a cold draft and wedged a folded piece of cloth into it, which didn't fix it but improved the situation. Caleb came in from the barn at mid-morning and stopped just inside the door. He looked at the biscuits on the table. He looked at the swept floor. He looked at Lydia, who was sitting in the chair feeding Clara and watching him with an expression she was fairly sure communicated that she was waiting for him to say something about it. "You didn't have to do any of that," he said. "I know." He took off his coat and hung it on the peg by the door. "Thank you." "Don't make it a thing." He didn't. He sat down, ate 2 biscuits, drank his coffee, and asked if Clara had slept all right. That was it. No commentary on the gesture, no elevation of it into something it wasn't, just acknowledgement and movement. She could work with that. The days developed their own rhythm, the way days do when you're not fighting them. Caleb rose before light and was in the barn by the time Lydia woke. She managed the cabin, cooking, cleaning, tending Clara. In the afternoons, when Clara napped, she began coming outside to see what work needed doing, and there was always work. The left side of the porch needed new boards. A section of fence in the east pasture was leaning bad. The chicken coop, she hadn't known about the chickens until the 3rd day when she heard them, had a gap near the base where something had been getting in. She started with what she could reach. She didn't ask permission. She didn't announce what she was doing. She just did it. The first time Caleb came around the corner of the cabin and found her on her knees in the mud patching the chicken coop with scrap boards and a hammer she'd found in the barn. He stood there for a moment. "You know what you're doing with that?" he asked. "More or less." He watched her drive a nail, watched her pull it when it went crooked and reset it. Didn't offer to take over. "More or less works," he said, and went back to whatever he'd been doing. It was the kindest thing anyone had said to her in years, and the fact that it was so small was what made it land. 3 weeks in, Caleb came back from town with supplies and a piece of information he seemed uncertain about delivering. He set the goods on the table and stood by the door longer than usual before he said anything. "Holt's been asking questions," he said. Lydia was sitting at the table mending a tear in the baby's blanket, and she went very still. "What kind of questions?" "The kind that suggest he thinks the transaction he agreed to might be renegotiable." Caleb's voice was flat. He was managing something behind it, she could tell, but he was managing it well. "He's been telling people in town that there were conditions attached to the sale that weren't met. That's not true. But he's saying it, which means at some point he's going to show up with paperwork and a story." Lydia set the blanket down. "And I wanted you to know before you heard it from someone else." He came to the table and sat down. "I also want you to know that it doesn't change anything from my end. What I paid was legitimate. I've got the receipt. I've got a lawyer in Millhaven who knows the situation and is already prepared to argue it if it comes to that." She looked at him. "You planned for this." "I planned for the possibility of it, yes. Before you even knew who I was." He was quiet for a moment. "I'd been aware of Holt's operation for a while. I knew what he was running out of that yard. I'd been watching and not acting, which is its own kind of failure, and I'd gotten tired of it." He looked at the table, not at her. "It wasn't a rescue. I want to be clear about that. I don't think of what I did as rescuing you." "Then what do you think of it as?" "Correcting a situation I should have moved on sooner." He picked up his coffee cup, found it empty, set it back down. "You would have found a way out eventually. You had that look." "What look?" "The look of someone who's still working the problem." She didn't say anything for a long moment. Outside, a wind came up and moved through the grass, and the cattle shifted in the far pasture, and Clara, asleep in the crate-turned cradle Caleb had built in the first week without mentioning he was doing it, made a small sound and settled. "Your sister," Lydia said carefully. "Did she get out?" The silence that followed was long enough that she thought he wasn't going to answer. "No," he said, just the one word. But the weight of it was very specific. The weight of a question that had been asked and answered a long time ago, and the answer had been final, And the man sitting across from her had been carrying it ever since without any particular interest in putting it down. Lydia nodded. She didn't offer condolences. She didn't reach for comfort words. She understood that some losses don't want comfort. They want acknowledgement, which is different. She acknowledged it and left it alone, and they sat in the quiet for a while. It was not a comfortable quiet, but it was an honest one. The threat from Holt materialized 6 days later, not as Holt himself, but as a man who rode out on a gray horse on a Thursday morning and introduced himself as an associate of Mr. Holt's, with some paperwork he believed would be of interest to Mr. Whitlock. He was a lawyer of some kind, or had been, the kind that had drifted too far west and too close to the wrong people to maintain anything that resembled integrity. He had a briefcase and a carefully neutral expression, and he smiled at Lydia when she answered the door in a way that did not contain any actual warmth. "Ma'am, is Mr. Whitlock available?" "He's in the barn," she said. "Perhaps you could—" "I can hear him." Caleb's voice came from around the corner of the cabin, where he'd apparently been working on the porch support. He came into view with a hammer still in his hand and sawdust on his coat and regarded the lawyer and the briefcase without much visible emotion. "Come on, then." They went inside. Lydia stayed in the doorway, where she was technically not in the room but could hear everything. The lawyer's argument was what she'd expected and worse than she'd feared, not in its legal strength, which appeared weak, but in its particular nastiness. Holt was claiming that the original transaction had been informal and non-binding, that the money Caleb paid had been received under duress and without proper documentation, and that Lydia remained, under the terms of a work contract executed in 1873, the lawful obligation of Warren Holt's business operation for a period of no less than 8 additional months. The work contract. She knew about the work contract. She'd signed it without understanding it, at 15, before she'd known what the language meant. She heard Caleb say very quietly, "You can tell Mr. Holt that I have the receipt for our transaction, signed by him in the presence of 11 witnesses, and that if he'd like to argue its validity, I'm delighted to have that conversation in front of a judge, in Millhaven, where my lawyer practices." A pause. "I'd also like to point out that the contract you're referencing would, if examined in open court, expose Mr. Holt to a level of legal scrutiny he almost certainly doesn't want." Another pause, longer. "I think," Caleb said, "you should ride back and share that with him." The lawyer left. Lydia watched him ride back down the track from the porch, the gray horse moving steady and unhurried, the briefcase presumably full of paperwork that was about to become somebody else's problem. Caleb came out and stood beside her. "He'll come back," she said. "Holt doesn't give up on money." "He might not give up," Caleb said, "but he'll have to calculate whether the fight is worth the risk. And I don't think it is, for him." He was quiet for a moment. "You all right?" She thought about the work contract, about the 15-year-old girl who had signed it in a room with 2 men and a lamp, and no one who was interested in explaining what she was agreeing to. "No," she said, "but I will be." He nodded, accepting that. It was the right answer. Not everything needed fixing right away. Some things you just had to carry for a while before you could set them down. The days continued. Clara grew. Her legs got stronger, her voice got louder, and she developed a strong preference for being held in a specific way, up on the left shoulder with her cheek against the collarbone, and she would inform you at considerable volume if you got it wrong. Caleb learned this preference during the first week of the second month, when Lydia had her hands in dishwater and Clara started crying, and Caleb picked her up and spent 2 minutes trying different positions until he landed on the right one, and the crying stopped, and he stood very still, apparently surprised by his own success. Lydia watched this without saying anything. She stored it somewhere. She was still watching him the way she'd always watched people, carefully, cataloging, waiting for the revision. Waiting for the moment when the version of himself he'd been presenting would slip and reveal the version underneath that she knew how to deal with, the one that wanted something, the one with the real terms of the arrangement. She had been waiting for this revision for 6 weeks, and it hadn't come. What had come instead was Caleb burning a pot of beans on the stove and swearing under his breath and having to air out the cabin for an hour. It was Caleb coming in from a hard day and being short with her. Not cruel, but clipped, distracted, saying only what was necessary, and disappearing to the loft early. It was Caleb having a nightmare of his own on 2 separate nights. Sounds she could hear through the floor that she'd pretended not to hear because she understood about those, and privacy was the only thing you could give a person for it. It was, in other words, a real person. Not a kind version of a type she knew, but an actual man with specific moods and specific bad days and specific ways of recovering from them. She had not known what to do with that. She was still working on it. Then came the evening near the end of April when everything shifted. Lydia was in the barn when she heard it. Not Clara, not Caleb, not any of the familiar sounds of the ranch in the late afternoon. A different sound. Small and outside and coming from somewhere near the fence line on the north side. She put down what she was doing. The sound, when she found it, turned out to be a child. A girl, maybe 7 years old, sitting in the dirt on the other side of the fence, with her knees pulled up and her arms wrapped around them, wearing a dress that was too thin for the still cool April evenings and shoes that didn't match. Her face was dirty. Her left arm, when she finally let Lydia see it, had a bruise across the forearm in a shape that was not accidental. She would not say her name at first. She would not say anything. She sat and watched Lydia with the flat, evaluating eyes of a child who has learned that most adults require something from you before they give you anything. Lydia sat down in the dirt beside her, not crouching, not bending over, not offering her hand in the over-deliberate way people did when they wanted to seem less threatening. She just sat down, at the child's level, with her back to the fence. "You don't have to say anything," Lydia said. "I'm just going to sit here for a minute." The girl watched her. "There's food in the cabin," Lydia said. "When you're ready." She didn't add anything else. She sat for about 5 minutes, watching the cattle in the pasture, giving the child time to calculate without any additional pressure on the calculation. Then she stood up and walked back toward the cabin without looking back. She heard the small footsteps behind her before she reached the porch. Caleb was at the table when they came in. He looked at Lydia. He looked at the girl, who had stopped just inside the door and was pressed against the wall as if she might need to go back through it quickly. He looked at Lydia again. Lydia met his eyes. She didn't have an explanation that would have helped. She just looked at him the way you look at someone when you're asking them to trust a decision before you've had time to explain it. He got up from the table and pulled a third chair over to it without a word. "I'll cut some more cornbread," he said. The girl's name was Nora. They learned this in stages. Her name the first night, her age the second day, the broad shape of what had happened to her over the course of the first week, in pieces and fragments, never the whole thing at once. She had been left. She had been hurt before she was left. The person who had done the hurting was not in any immediate position to be coming back for her, which was the piece of information Caleb went to town to verify and returned 3 days later having satisfied himself about. "She stays," Lydia said. She had not phrased it as a question. Caleb sat down and looked at her for a long moment. "I know," he said. "You're sure?" "I've got a spare room in the loft," he said. "It'll need some work. The boards need chinked and there's no window." He was already thinking practically, already moving the problem from the abstract to the manageable. "She'll need different shoes." Lydia looked at him. She had been prepared for negotiation, for hesitation, for the reasonable, cautious response of a man who had already taken on one woman and one infant and might reasonably balk at a third dependent. She had not been prepared for him to move immediately to the shoes. "Caleb," he looked up. "Why are you—" She stopped, found the right end of the question. "You keep doing this, taking in people who weren't yours to take in." He was quiet for a moment. "I spent a long time not doing it," he said. "Watching things happen that I had the capacity to do something about and finding reasons not to. Practical reasons. Good reasons." He looked at the table. None of the reasons made the thing stop happening. He stood up and carried his coffee cup to the wash basin. "Besides," he said, over his shoulder, "it's not me doing the taking in, it's you. I'm just the one with the cabin." Lydia sat with that for a moment. Then she went to find Nora, who was in the barn, which had become the place Nora went when the walls of the cabin felt too close, a thing Lydia understood with a specificity that had nothing to do with being told. She found the girl sitting in the hay next to the horse, not touching him, just near him, absorbing the uncomplicated warmth of a large animal that had no expectations. Lydia sat down next to her. "You're going to stay here for a while," she said, "if you want." Nora looked at her, 7 years old with those old eyes and a bruise that was yellowing at the edges as it healed. With you? With me. And with the man in the cabin, who is gruff and burns beans sometimes, and is actually very decent once you get past the part where he doesn't talk much. She paused. And with Clara, who will want to grab your hair, so keep it in a braid. Something moved through Nora's face. Not a smile, not yet, but the early conditions of one. The specific expression of a child who has been offered something and hasn't yet decided whether it's safe to want it. Okay, she said. Just the one word. But it filled the barn up to the rafters. May came in warm and fast that year, the way Texas spring sometimes did. Like the season had been late to something and was making up time. The frost that had been a fact of life for months disappeared almost overnight, and the ground softened and the cattle put on weight, and Nora stopped pressing herself against walls when she moved through the cabin. That last thing happened so gradually that Lydia almost missed the moment it became true. One morning she looked up from the stove, and Nora was simply standing in the middle of the room, not braced against anything, just standing, watching Clara attempt to push herself upright in the crate cradle and failing repeatedly with great determination. Nora had her arms at her sides and she was almost smiling, and she wasn't watching the door. Lydia turned back to the stove so the girl wouldn't know she'd noticed. Small things. That was how recovery moved, when it moved at all. In increments too small to celebrate, which meant you had to pay attention or you'd miss the whole of it. The ranch had changed too. Not dramatically, not the way stories like to describe transformation, but in the accumulated small ways that added up to something real when you stepped back far enough to see it. The left side of the porch no longer sagged. The fence line was solid. The chicken coop had 2 new boards along the base and had stopped losing birds to whatever had been getting in. Caleb had spent 3 weekends chinking the boards in the loft space that had become Nora's room, and now there was also a window, small, south-facing, letting in a rectangle of afternoon light that Nora sat in when she thought no one was watching. Lydia and Caleb worked alongside each other in the easy, unsentimental way that people develop when they've been sharing labor long enough that the coordination becomes instinctive. She knew which tasks he'd get to first and which ones he let slide too long. He knew she'd rather be told about a problem directly than have it managed around her. They'd had exactly one real argument over the best way to handle a sick calf that turned out to require both their approaches in sequence, which neither of them acknowledged directly afterward, though the calf survived. It was not a perfect arrangement. It was a functional one, which in Lydia's experience was considerably more durable. What she had not accounted for was how visible they'd become. Harlan Creek was 11 miles south. Millhaven was 22 miles west. The Whitlock Ranch sat between both towns on a road that enough people traveled that word moved along it with some regularity. And the word that had been moving, she discovered in early May when she rode with Caleb to Millhaven for supplies, was not comfortable. She became aware of it in the dry goods store, where the woman behind the counter was pleasant enough on the surface and managed to work into the conversation with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd rehearsed it, that folks in town had been curious about the situation out at the Whitlock place. The phrasing was careful. The curiosity was not. "People talk," Caleb said on the ride back before Lydia could say anything about it. "I know people talk. Let them." Easy to say when it's not your reputation they're talking about. He was quiet for a moment. The wagon moved through the afternoon heat, and the road dust rose and settled. "They're talking about mine too," he said. "Half of them think I've lost my mind. The other half think I'm running some kind of—" He stopped. "It doesn't matter what they think I'm running. What matters is what's actually happening, which is a ranch and 2 children and work that needs doing." Lydia looked at the road ahead. "Nora's not mine," she said. "Legally, she's not Clara's either. If someone decides to make an issue of it, then we deal with it when it happens. That's not a plan, Caleb." "No," he agreed. "It's not." They rode the rest of the way in silence, but it was a working silence, the kind where both people are turning the same problem from different angles and not yet ready to compare notes. The issue came to a head 2 weeks later, though not in the form either of them had anticipated. It wasn't Holt. Holt had gone quiet since the lawyer's visit, which Caleb's attorney in Millhaven interpreted as the silence of a man calculating odds rather than a man who had given up. It wasn't the town gossip either, which had its own momentum but hadn't yet produced anything actionable. It was three men on horseback who came down the track on a Wednesday afternoon while Caleb was in the far pasture and Lydia was hanging laundry and Nora was in the barn and Clara was asleep in the cabin. They didn't announce themselves. They rode right into the yard and stopped, and the one in front, heavy-set, with a badge that Lydia clocked immediately, looked at her the way officials looked at women in her position, which was with the specific blankness of someone who had already made a decision and was here to execute it. "Looking for Warren Holt's property," he said. "There's no property of Warren Holt's on this land," she said. "We've got a document that suggests otherwise." He reached into his coat. "Signed work contract valid through—" "I know what it says," Lydia said. "I was there when I signed it, which I did at 15 without legal counsel, and under conditions that an actual court would find interesting." She kept her voice level. "You'll want to speak with Caleb Whitlock, who owns this property and has his own documentation, and whose lawyer is in Millhaven. I can give you a name." The man in front wasn't used to being redirected. She could see that. He'd been expecting fear, or at minimum uncertainty, and she was giving him neither, which made him unsure what to do with his authority. The two men behind him exchanged a look. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to—" She said, "Speak to me." Caleb had come up from the south end of the property without any of them hearing him. He was still 20 yards out, but he was moving with purpose, and his voice had carried across the yard in a way that was not raised, but also was not gentle. He covered the distance and stopped between Lydia and the three horses and looked up at the man with the badge with an expression that Lydia had seen once before, in the cattle yard in Harlan Creek, from the back of the crowd, just before he'd made his bid. Calm that had iron in the middle of it. "Deputy," Caleb said, "I know what document you've got, and I can tell you right now it's built on a transaction that Warren Holt voided when he accepted payment from me in front of 11 witnesses and signed a receipt acknowledging the transfer. You want to argue that I'll have my lawyer in Millhaven send you a letter that explains why that argument is going to cost Holt more than it recovers." He paused. "Or you can ride back and tell him to let it go, which is the advice I'd be giving if I were his lawyer instead of mine." The deputy looked at the document in his hand. He looked at Caleb. He was a man who enforced things other people decided, and he was beginning to calculate whether the thing he'd been sent to enforce was worth the friction. "This isn't settled," he said. "No," Caleb agreed, "but it will be, through the right channels." They rode out. Lydia stood in the yard and watched them go and did not let herself react until they were past the tree line and out of sight. Then she sat down on the porch steps because her legs had apparently been waiting for permission to shake and now had it. Caleb sat down beside her. Not close, just on the same step. "That's not the last of it," she said. "No. Holt's escalating. He went from a lawyer to a badge." "Yes. Which means he's going to keep going until he finds something that works or until—" She stopped. "What is he actually after? The money's spent. I'm not— What does he get from dragging me back that's worth this much trouble?" Caleb was quiet for a moment. "Control," he said. "Some men are like that. It's not the economics, it's the principle of the thing. He lets something go and he doesn't let things go." Lydia thought about Warren Holt's flat eyes, the way he'd said, "Get her up," in the barn, 2 hours after Clara was born, with the inflection of a man who had never in his life been told no and absorbed it. "He's going to come himself next time," she said. "Probably." "And what do we do when he does?" Caleb picked up a small stone from the porch step, turned it over in his fingers, set it back down. "I've been thinking about that," he said, "and I think the answer is that we stop being reactive and start being the ones who move first." She looked at him. "Holt's operation isn't clean," he said. "I've known that for a while. The kind of contracts he writes, the kind of transactions he runs, there are records, ledgers, people who were part of it who might be willing to talk if someone gave them a reason to." He looked at the road. "My lawyer has a contact in the county seat, a man who has reason to be interested in what Holt's been doing, professionally and legally. If we bring him what he needs before Holt can get his story straight—" "You're talking about going after him," Lydia said, "not just defending against him." "I'm talking about ending it," Caleb said, "properly, so that he can't come back with a new document and a different badge every few months for the next 2 years." Lydia thought about this. She thought about the 15-year-old girl who had signed a document she didn't understand and the stack of other documents that surely existed. Other contracts, other transactions, other people who'd passed through Holt's yard the way she had. "If you do this," she said carefully, "it's going to cost money, legal fees, travel, time away from the ranch." "I know. And it might not work. Also know that. And even if it works, people in this county are going to know your name is attached to it. They're going to know you spent your own money to fight Warren Holt over a woman you—" She stopped, found the right framing. "Over someone who isn't, legally, your family?" Caleb turned and looked at her directly. "Lydia, I know all of that. I've been sitting with all of that for 3 weeks." He was quiet for a beat. "I'm still going to do it." She looked back at him. The afternoon sun was low and coming in at an angle, and there was hay on his coat from the pasture work, and he had the look of a man who had made a decision and wasn't interested in being talked out of it, which she recognized because she wore the same expression herself on days when she'd found her footing. She didn't thank him. She'd learned that he didn't want thanks, or rather, that thanks made him uncomfortable in the way that attention made some people uncomfortable, like it put a spotlight on something he was trying to keep ordinary. "All right," she said. "All right," he said. They sat on the porch until the light went, and then they went inside and fed the children and went through the motions of the evening, and there was something different in the air of the cabin that night. Not settled, not safe, but directed. Pointed at something. The particular tension of people who have agreed on a course of action and are now simply waiting for morning to begin it. The situation with Holt broke open 6 days later, and it broke in the direction of the worst possible timing. Caleb had gone to Millhaven to see his lawyer. He'd left at first light and estimated he'd be back by dark. Lydia had Nora and Clara and the work of the ranch, and she'd managed all of it before, and saw no reason Tuesday should be different from any other day. It was different because Holt came himself. He came in the early afternoon with 2 men she didn't recognize, not lawyers, not deputies, just men, the kind hired for their size and their willingness to stand where they were put. Holt dismounted at the yard fence and opened the gate himself, which told her he'd been here before, or had been told the layout, because he moved through the yard with the confidence of someone who considered it already his. Lydia came out of the cabin before he reached the porch. She had Clara on her hip. Nora was in the barn, and she hoped Nora stayed there. Holt stopped at the bottom of the porch steps and looked at her the way he'd looked at her in the auction yard. The evaluating look, the inventory look, the look that reduced everything it touched to a line item. "Where's Whitlock?" he said. "Not here." Something moved through his expression. Not surprise, satisfaction maybe. The satisfaction of a man who had planned for a variable and found it where he expected. "Convenient. He'll be back by evening. I'm not here to see Whitlock." He took 1 step up onto the porch. Just 1. Testing. "I'm here to correct a situation that's gotten out of hand." Lydia shifted Clara higher on her hip. She kept her voice even. "There's no situation to correct. What was agreed upon in front of witnesses, and what was agreed upon," Holt said, "was based on a misrepresentation. The item transferred was encumbered by a prior contract, which means the transfer itself was invalid." He was using his business voice now, flat, procedural, the voice of a man who had learned that saying legal-sounding things with confidence made most people step back. "I'm here to reclaim what's mine. You can come without a scene, or—" "No." The word came out so cleanly that it seemed to surprise even her. There was no preparation in it, no breath taken before it. It was just there, immediate and complete. Holt looked at her. "No," she said again. "I'm not going anywhere with you. Not today, not because your men are bigger than me, not for any document you've had written up. I have a child on my hip and a child in that barn, and this is the land I work, and you are going to get back on your horse and ride back to Harlan Creek." There was a long moment. One of the men behind Holt shifted his weight. Holt's jaw tightened. He was not a man who was accustomed to being told no by someone he'd already decided didn't have the standing to say it. He was calculating, she could see the calculation, whether to push the moment and what that would cost him if Whitlock came back and found the situation had turned physical. "You think he's going to protect you forever?" Holt said. The voice had dropped. The procedural tone was gone, and underneath it was something older and more honest. Whitlock's going to calculate the cost eventually. He's a practical man. Practical men don't spend indefinitely on things that aren't theirs. Maybe, Lydia said, but he's spending today, and today is the day that matters. She did not look away from him. Her arms were shaking with the weight of Clara and the effort of not showing anything she didn't choose to show. But she did not look away. Holt held her gaze for 5 seconds, 10, 15. Then he took the step back down off the porch. "This isn't over," he said. "I know," she said. "Come back with the judge." He rode out. His men rode out behind him, and the yard was empty, and Lydia stood on the porch until the sound of hooves faded, and then she sat down on the steps and held Clara very tightly and breathed. Nora appeared from around the side of the barn. She'd been watching from the gap in the boards. Lydia could tell by the particular angle she came from. She crossed the yard and stopped at the bottom of the steps. "Is he coming back?" she asked. Lydia thought about the right answer, the honest one. "Maybe," she said. "But not today." Nora sat down on the step below her. She didn't say anything else. She just sat there, a 7-year-old with old eyes, staying close in the way she'd started to do when she sensed that closeness was what was needed. Not comfort, not words, just presence. Lydia put her free arm around the girl's thin shoulders and felt her lean in slightly, just slightly, the way a person did when they'd learned that leaning was permitted. When Caleb came home at dusk and she told him what had happened, the stillness that came over him was different from his usual stillness. His usual stillness was the absence of urgency. This was the stillness of something being very carefully contained. He put his foot on the porch step, he said. Just one. He stepped back. Caleb was standing in the middle of the cabin looking at the table. "And you were alone." "I was." "With both children here." "Caleb." She waited until he looked at her. "I handled it." "I know you did." He finally sat down. "That's not what I'm upset about." "Then what are you upset about?" He looked at his hands on the table. "That you had to." She didn't have a response for that, so she didn't manufacture one. She sat across from him and let it be true, and they stayed in the kitchen while the fire burned down and the children slept and the dark settled over the ranch. And after a while, Caleb looked up. "I talked to my lawyer today," he said. "He's spoken to the contact in the county seat. There's enough in Holt's history, enough provable, documented, on-record business, that the man is willing to open a formal inquiry." He paused. "It's going to take time, and there's no guarantee of how it lands, but it moves. It actually moves." "How much?" Lydia asked. He named a figure. It was a significant portion of what he had. She looked at him. "Caleb, I know what it is. If the inquiry doesn't go the way your lawyer thinks, you've spent that money for nothing, and Holt still—" "Lydia." He said her name the way he sometimes did, not as a way of stopping her, but as a way of making sure she was hearing the thing he was actually saying rather than the one she expected. "I know the risk. I've run the numbers more than once. I'm going in with my eyes open." He looked at her steadily. "This is what I've decided to do. I'm not asking you to take on the burden of that decision. I'm telling you because you have a right to know what's happening on land you help run." She held his gaze. "You said land you help run." "That's what I said." "Not land you work on, or land you stay on." He was quiet for a moment. "I meant what I said." Something shifted in her chest. Not dramatically, not the way it happened in the stories the women in Harlan Creek used to tell each other in the dark, the ones where things pivoted on a single moment, and everything that came after was different. This was quieter, like a door that had been partly open for a while had simply moved another inch. She looked down at her hands. "All right," she said. "Then do it." The inquiry was filed in the 3rd week of May, and the town of Harlan Creek, which had been watching the Whitlock Ranch with casual interest, began paying considerably sharper attention. The feed supplier who'd been at the auction, a man named Pruitt, who had reason to want Holt's credit arrangements examined, sent a note to Caleb's lawyer within the week. A woman who'd worked Holt's cook fires for 2 years before Dottie, who now ran a rooming house in a town called Ferris, sent a more substantive account written in a hand that was careful and deliberate, that arrived 12 days after the inquiry was filed. And Dottie herself, the woman who had steered Lydia toward the barn stall on that cold March morning and laid her apron down and not asked anyone's permission. Dottie wrote a 4-page letter that Caleb's lawyer described as exceptionally useful, and that made Lydia, when she was told the contents, sit down in a chair and look at the ceiling for a long time. She knew, Lydia said. She knew what he was doing, to all of them. For years, Caleb said, she was waiting for somewhere to send it. Lydia thought about Dottie's hands on that cold morning, the apron on the ground, the way she'd moved without asking permission, because asking permission for small acts of mercy was a faster way to get them denied. Someone needs to write to her, Lydia said. I'll have my lawyer? No. Lydia shook her head. I'll write to her. Myself. She did. That evening, after the children were in bed, she sat at the table with the lamp and the paper and wrote a letter that took 3 drafts to get right. Not because she didn't know what she wanted to say, but because she'd spent so many years without anyone to say it to that the words kept coming out in the wrong order. The final version was 2 pages. It said what it needed to say. It told Dottie what her letter had meant. It told her about Clara and about Nora and about the ranch and the porch that no longer sagged and the chicken coop and the south-facing window in the loft. It said, "You did not have to lay your apron down, but you did, and I have not forgotten it, and I will not." She sealed it and gave it to Caleb to include with the lawyer's correspondence, and then she sat at the table for a while longer with the lamp burning and the ranch quiet around her. She was trying to identify the feeling in her chest. She'd been doing this more often lately, encountering emotions she didn't have ready names for because they were things she hadn't been permitted to feel in long enough that she'd lost the vocabulary. This one was something like, I am fighting back, not just surviving, not just enduring, actually fighting with the tools available on ground I've chosen. It was not triumphant. It did not feel finished. Holt was still out there, and the inquiry was still new, and there were at least a dozen ways this could go wrong. But she was not on a platform in a cattle yard. She was at a table in a house, with a lamp, and children sleeping above her, and a man she trusted in the next room, and a letter she'd written herself, with words she'd chosen, saying things she meant. The girl who'd been sold for $200 was becoming something else, slowly, painfully, not in a straight line, but becoming. Holt came back 18 days later, not to the ranch this time, to the county courthouse, with a lawyer who was considerably more credentialed than the last one, and a stack of documents that he'd apparently been assembling for months. Caleb got word from his attorney on a Friday morning and rode out to tell Lydia in the east pasture where she was working the fence line. She listened to the whole thing without interrupting, the new filing, the amended claim, the argument that the original receipt had been coerced. When he finished, she drove the fence staple she'd been holding into the post with 2 clean strikes and pulled the wire taut. "What does your lawyer say?" she asked. "He says it's survivable. He says Holt is spending money he doesn't have on a case that's getting weaker the more the inquiry turns up." He paused. "He also says it's going to get louder before it gets quieter." Lydia moved to the next post. "Then it gets louder. People are going to talk more. They're going to come down on sides. Some of them are going to come down on his. People have been talking since March," she said. "It hasn't changed anything that matters." Caleb watched her work. She could feel him watching. Not the evaluating kind of watching, but the kind where someone is seeing you clearly and holding what they see carefully. "There's something I want to say," he said, "and I want to say it before it becomes the kind of thing I've been meaning to say for so long it gets strange." She kept working. "Say it." "I'm not doing this for obligation," he said. "I want to be clear about that. What I started this as, what I told myself it was, correcting a situation, paying a debt I owed to someone I couldn't reach anymore. That's not what it is now." He paused. "This is my family, you and Clara and Nora. That's what this is. And I want that to be named because things that aren't named tend to get misunderstood." She drove another staple, pulled the wire, tested it. Then she turned and looked at him. He was standing in the May afternoon with the cattle in the background and the sky going its particular pale blue above the Texas hills, and he looked like what he was. A tired, decent, imperfect man who had said a true thing out loud at some personal cost, because he'd decided not saying it was costing more. "I know," she said. "You know I know," she said again, clearly. "I've known for a while." He nodded. He didn't push for more, and she didn't offer it, because this was where they both were. Not at the end of something, not at the clean beginning of something, but somewhere honest in the middle, which was the only place that was actually real. She turned back to the fence. "There are 12 more posts on this line," she said. "You could help." He picked up the other hammer. They worked until the light went. The county inquiry into Warren Holt's business practices was not a dramatic event. There was no single morning when everything cracked open and the truth came flooding through. It was more like what happened to a dam when the water had been pressing against it for too long. Small failures first, then larger ones, then a point of no return that arrived quietly, and then all at once. Through June and into July, the documents accumulated. Caleb's lawyer made 4 trips to the county seat. Dottie's letter was entered into the formal record. The woman from Ferris, her name was Marjorie, Lydia learned, and she had 2 children of her own now, and a husband who ran a freight operation, sent a second account that was more specific than the first, with dates and names and the kind of detail that was hard to fabricate and harder to refute. Pruitt, the feed supplier, turned out to have ledger records going back 6 years that showed the specific financial architecture of what Holt had been running, which was not only morally indefensible, but had involved enough creative bookkeeping to attract the serious interest of men whose job was to care about such things professionally. None of this made the ranch easier to run in the meantime. June was hard in the way that months were hard when everything demanded attention simultaneously, and there was only so much labor available. 2 of the cattle came down sick with something that required Caleb to spend 3 days managing them around the clock, which meant the regular work fell to Lydia, which meant Nora spent more time minding Clara than a 7-year-old should reasonably have been asked to, and Nora did it without complaint, which was its own kind of thing that Lydia carried with her. Clara was pulling herself upright now, not walking, not yet, but standing at the edge of the crate cradle with both fists gripping the rail and her whole body vibrating with the effort and the pride of it. She had 4 teeth and opinions about everything. She had started reaching for Caleb when he came in from the barn, which he managed with the studied casualness of a man pretending he hadn't noticed something that had clearly reached him somewhere he kept private. Lydia noticed. She kept that too, in the same place she kept everything that mattered. Not spoken about, not examined too directly, just held. The nightmares came back in June. They hadn't been gone entirely, but they'd been manageable. The specific kind of bad dream that you could shake off before your feet hit the floor, that didn't follow you into the morning. In June, they got worse. She woke on a Tuesday with her heart going at twice its normal rate, and the barn smell so vivid in her nose that she checked, for one disoriented moment, whether she was actually in the cattle yard. She was in the cabin bed. The fire was low. Clara was breathing. Nora was in the loft. She lay in the dark for a long time. The problem with nightmares, the specific problem she'd discovered over the years, was that they were honest. They didn't invent things. They replayed things. They took the actual events and ran them again without any of the distance that the waking hours allowed you to construct. And in the replay, there was nothing she could do differently because it had already happened, and the outcome was already known, and the only available response was to survive the knowing again. She got up, she added a log to the fire. She made coffee she didn't particularly want and sat at the table in the dark and drank it. Caleb found her there when he came down at first light, which was earlier than usual. He stopped at the bottom of the ladder from the loft and looked at her and said nothing for a moment. "How long have you been up?" he asked. "A while." He came to the table and sat down across from her. He didn't ask what the dream was. He had the decency, or the experience, to understand that asking someone to narrate a nightmare was its own small cruelty. "Used to happen to me," he said. He paused. "After my sister. For about 2 years I'd wake up in the middle of the night and I'd be in the moment I found out, over and over, every time like it was new." Lydia wrapped her hands around the tin cup. "What made it stop?" He thought about it. It didn't stop. It just came less often. And the gap between waking up and knowing where I actually was got shorter. He looked at the table. "One day I realized I'd slept through the whole night and I didn't know what to do with myself." She almost laughed. Not because it was funny, exactly, but because it was the kind of true thing that sat right next to absurd. I keep thinking I should be further along, she said. It came out more honestly than she'd intended. It's been months. I'm on a different piece of land entirely, and my brain still thinks it's March. That's not a flaw, Caleb said. That's just how long it takes. I know that. Do you? She looked at him. Not always. He nodded. He got up and poured himself coffee and came back to the table. Outside, the first gray light was doing its slow work on the sky, and the cattle were moving in the pasture, and somewhere in the barn a chicken was making an announcement about something. There's something I want to ask you, Lydia said. All right. The inquiry, the money you've spent. If it goes the wrong way, if Holt's lawyer finds something, or the judge leans in a direction we don't want, what are you actually willing to lose? He looked at his hands. What do you mean? I mean the ranch, the cattle, the operation. If Holt's claim gets upheld somehow and it turns into a battle over assets, what's the floor? What's the thing you won't give up? He was quiet for long enough that she thought he might not answer directly. Then he said, The four of us, that's the floor. She sat with that. The ranch isn't the floor. No. The money isn't. No. She turned the tin cup in her hands. The fire had come up with the new log, and the light in the cabin had shifted from dark to the particular amber of early morning with fire in it. You're a different kind of man than I thought existed, she said. I'm a regular man, he said. I just had a long time alone to figure out which things were worth the trouble. She thought about that for most of the morning, while she worked, and while she managed Clara, and while she watched Nora in the barn, doing the things she'd started doing lately. Talking quietly to the horse, working out some internal accounting in a register too low for anyone else to hear. She thought about what it meant to have been so thoroughly convinced that men were one kind of thing, that encountering a different kind was still, months later, something she couldn't fully trust herself to read. She was getting better at it. She was not there yet. The legal situation resolved itself not with a verdict, but with a withdrawal. Caleb's lawyer sent word on a Thursday in late July. A letter that arrived folded inside another letter, the outer envelope containing a brief note from the lawyer, and the inner one containing documentation from the county inquiry that Lydia had to read twice before she understood what she was reading. Holt had withdrawn his claims. All of them. The amended filing, the original work contract argument, the contention that the transaction had been coerced. Withdrawn, with a notation from his own lawyer that the client had determined the matters were best resolved without further litigation. There was a second piece of paper. It was a formal release signed by Holt, acknowledging the validity of the original transaction and waiving any future claim. Lydia held this piece of paper for a long time. Caleb came in from the barn and found her standing at the table with the papers in her hand, and he read her face before he read the documents. It's over? He said. He withdrew. She set the papers down. His lawyer filed it 3 days ago. Your lawyer's letter says he thinks the inquiry scared him, that the ledger records Pruitt gave them would have exposed the whole operation if it went to court. She paused. He cut his losses. Caleb stood in the doorway. He had mud on his boots and hay on his coat, and the expression of a man who had been preparing for a long fight and had just been told it was finished. Good, he said, just the one word. She'd expected more, relief, visible, the way relief usually showed in people. What she got was the quiet absorption of a man who had spent enough of himself on the fight that its ending felt less like victory and more like the return of something that had been on loan. He came to the table and picked up the release document. He read it. He set it down. You all right? He asked. I don't know what I am. That's fair. She sat down. The afternoon light was coming through the window, and Clara was in the crate doing her standing practice, and Nora was upstairs in her room with the south-facing light, which is where she went when she needed to think. The cabin smelled of cornbread from the morning, and something green from outside where the summer had made itself fully at home. I keep waiting to feel something more than this, Lydia said. Something cleaner. Some kind of... She moved her hand in a way that was meant to indicate a larger emotion than she was able to produce. I thought when it was over I'd feel it end. What does it feel like? Caleb asked. Like being told the storm passed while I was inside the house. I know it's different now, I can see it from the window. But I was so prepared for more of it that the not having more is its own kind of strange. He sat down across from her. That makes sense. Does it? When my sister died, he said slowly, I spent a long time after preparing for the next bad thing, waiting for it. When it didn't come, I didn't know how to use the space. He looked at his hands. Took me a while to understand that the waiting itself was the problem, that it was keeping me inside the storm even after the storm was gone. Lydia looked at him. How'd you stop? He was quiet for a moment. I stopped making the waiting more honest than the living, he said. The living was what was actually happening. The waiting was a story I was telling myself because it felt safer to expect loss than to let things be all right. She sat with this. Outside, a bird was making a sound she'd been hearing all summer from the tree at the east side of the yard, some kind of persistent commentary on the afternoon. She'd meant to ask what kind of bird it was and kept forgetting. I've been doing that, she said. I know. How long have you known? A while. She pressed her palms flat on the table. The scar on her right wrist, from the rope, the second time she'd tried to run 4 years ago, caught the light the way it sometimes did, and she looked at it, and then looked away, and then looked back, deliberately. She'd spent a lot of energy not looking at it. She was tired of that particular effort. Caleb, she said. Yeah. I want to stop being afraid of this. He didn't ask what this meant. He understood the sentence in its entirety. Then stop, he said, and then immediately, I know that's not how it works. I know it's not a decision you make once. I just mean, I know what you mean, she said. They were quiet for a moment. Then Clara, who had been conducting her standing experiments with increasing ambition all afternoon, let go of the rail. Both of them turned. She stood, unsupported, for approximately 3 seconds, her whole body vibrating with the effort, her face wearing the expression of a person who had just discovered something fundamental about how the world worked. Then she sat down hard, more surprised than hurt, and looked up at Lydia with an expression that said, plainly, that she expected some kind of accounting for what had just happened. Lydia laughed. It came out before she could think about it, before she could apply the habitual check she still ran on her own reactions, and it was a real laugh, not polite, not performed. It was the laugh of someone who had been caught off guard by delight. Caleb was smiling. He was trying not to, but it was already past the point where trying helped. Clara, taking note of her reception, did it again, grabbed the rail, pulled up, let go, stood for 4 seconds this time, and then sat down with great satisfaction. Nora's head appeared at the top of the loft ladder. She'd heard the commotion. She looked down at Clara and down at both adults and came down the ladder faster than she usually moved, and she sat on the floor next to Clara and said, again, with the focused intensity of a child who had appointed herself chief witness to the proceedings. Clara went again. The afternoon went like that, and the evening after it, with a lightness that Lydia recognized as rare and tried not to hold too tightly. She'd learned that holding lightness too tightly was what crushed it. She let it exist. She moved through it. She let the children be loud and Caleb be quietly pleased, and the supper be nothing special and the fire be warm. She had not felt at home anywhere since she was so young that the memory of it had blurred into something she could barely distinguish from imagination. She felt it now. Not as a conclusion, not as a thing she could point to and name, as a process, as an ongoing fact. The 3 weeks after the withdrawal were the quietest of Lydia's life on the ranch. And the quiet was something she had to learn to occupy the way you learn to occupy a room that was larger than what you were used to. It was not peaceful, exactly. Clara was walking now, which meant nothing that was on a low surface stayed there, and Nora had started school in Millhaven 3 days a week, which required an early start and a late return, and produced in the girl a particular kind of exhausted talkativeness by evening that Lydia was learning to navigate. The ranch itself demanded its summer labor, haying, fence maintenance, getting the cattle through the season in the best condition possible heading into fall. But the urgency that had been underneath everything for months was gone. The low-level readiness for the next bad thing. She still woke sometimes in the night, but the gap Caleb had described between waking and knowing where she actually was had shortened. Most mornings she knew within seconds. Some mornings she knew immediately. She counted that. The legal release had done something else, something she hadn't anticipated. It had given Caleb's name a certain standing in the county that he hadn't had before, not because he'd won a fight, but because he'd been seen to stand by something past the point where most men would have calculated it wasn't worth the trouble. The feed supplier Pruitt started sending referrals his way. A rancher 20 miles north made contact about buying stock. Caleb's lawyer wrote to say that several people who had been watching the situation with interest had expressed what he called favorable impressions, which in legal correspondence meant something useful. The ranch was not suddenly prosperous, but it was more viable than it had been in March, and the direction of the thing had turned. Dottie wrote back. The letter arrived on a Thursday in August, forwarded through Caleb's lawyer in the way that correspondence had moved during the inquiry period, and Lydia recognized the handwriting on the outside of the envelope with something that moved through her chest before she even opened it. It was long. Dottie wrote the way she did everything, without ceremony, without softening, but with a warmth that sat under the directness like heat under floorboards. She described her situation in the town she'd moved to. She described her relief that the inquiry had done what it needed to do. She described, in 2 careful paragraphs, what it had meant to her to receive Lydia's letter, phrased in such a way that Lydia had to stop reading for a moment and look at the ceiling and breathe. The last paragraph said, I have been thinking about what you described at the end of your letter, the ranch and the children and the man who bought the porch boards and the south window, and I want to say that there are people in this world who know a good thing when they find it, and people who do not. And I believe you are the former, even if you do not yet entirely believe it yourself. Lydia read that paragraph 3 times. She wrote back the same evening. 2 pages, then 3. She told Dottie about Clara walking. She told her about Nora's school and the horse in the barn and the bird in the east tree that she'd finally asked Caleb about and turned out to be a mockingbird, of all things, a bird that learned to sound like everything around it. She told Dottie that she had slept through the whole night twice last week. She told her, I think I'm starting to understand the difference between surviving a thing and being done surviving it. She sealed it and left it on the table and went to find Caleb, who was in the barn at the end of a long day, checking the water levels in the trough. She stood in the barn door. I want to ask you something, she said. He looked over. He had a tired look, the end of summer kind, when the work had been relentless and the body knew it. All right. That conversation we had on the fence line in May. She watched his face. When you said what you said about family, I remember. I want to know if you meant all of it. He straightened up. He was quiet for a moment, in the particular way that meant he was being precise rather than reluctant. Yes, he said. Then I want to tell you something, she said. I'm not there yet, at the full version of what you said. I want to be clear about that because I've spent years in arrangements that had unspoken terms, and I am not willing to do that again. I know, he said. I'm not asking for the full version. I'm patient. You shouldn't have to be patient indefinitely. I'm not doing it because I have to, he said. I'm doing it because what's here is already... He paused, looking for the word. It's already enough. Whatever comes after is additional. She looked at him. He was standing in the late afternoon light of the barn with his honest, tired face and his hay-covered coat, and he meant every word of it in the specific, unperformative way that she'd learned was simply how he was. Okay, she said. Okay? I'm not running from it anymore, she said. That's what I wanted to tell you. I don't have more than that right now, but I'm not running. He nodded once, slowly, the way he received information he was going to carry carefully. That's more than enough, he said. She went back to the cabin. She finished the letter to Dottie. She added one more line at the bottom, under the seal, because she'd thought of it walking back across the yard. P.S. The man doesn't burn the beans as often as he used to. I think that is progress. She smiled when she wrote it. She let herself do that. September came in the way Texas Septembers did, still hot during the day but with something different in the evening air, some message about what was coming, the way the light sat differently on the grass by late afternoon. The children felt it. Clara went through 3 days of being impossible and then emerged on the other side of it, sleeping 11 hours and eating everything put in front of her. Nora, who had been cautious about the school in Mill Haven in the way she was cautious about all new things, came home one Friday with a drawing she'd done that one of the teachers had apparently praised, and she held it out to Lydia at the door with the carefully controlled expression of someone trying not to show how much it had mattered. Lydia took the drawing and looked at it properly. It was the ranch, the cabin, the barn, the fence line, the cattle as small shapes in the back. There were 4 figures in front of the cabin. None of them were labeled, but there were 4 of them, and the smallest one had its arms spread wide, which was the specific way Nora had observed Clara move through the world. "This is good," Lydia said. "Not inflated, just true." Nora took the drawing back and held it carefully by the edges. She said I could put it on the wall, in the classroom, if I wanted. "Do you want to?" A pause. "Maybe." "Then maybe you should." Nora went upstairs. Lydia stood in the doorway for a moment and looked at the yard, at the late afternoon light on the fence boards, and the familiar sounds of the ranch settling into evening, and she held what she was feeling with both hands, carefully, the way you held something you'd learned not to squeeze too hard. It was still fragile, some of it. The nights were not all clear. There were days when the old weight came back and sat on her chest and she had to work around it. There were moments when she caught herself waiting for the turn, for the revision, for the thing underneath the good thing to show itself. But there were also evenings like this one, with the light going gold on the fence boards, and a child upstairs deciding whether to share her drawing with the world, and a baby somewhere behind her doing a walking lap of the cabin interior, and a man in the barn at the end of a day's work who had said, "It's already enough," and meant it. She had not thought such an evening was available to her. She had not let herself think it. She was thinking it now. The autumn came in sideways that year, the way it sometimes did in that part of Texas. Not gradually, not with the slow amber courtesy of a season transitioning, but with a single cold night in early October that changed everything overnight and left frost on the fence rails by morning. Lydia found it when she went out before light to check on the animals, her breath making small clouds in the dark, the ground hard under her feet in a way it hadn't been the day before. She stood in the yard for a moment, just standing, feeling the cold on her face with something that was not quite pleasure and not quite gratitude but sat somewhere between the two. The kind of feeling you got when your body reminded you that you were inside a season, inside a year, inside a life that was still moving. She had been on the Whitlock Ranch for 7 months. It felt longer than that in some ways. In others, she still turned corners in the cabin and experienced a half-second of disorientation, her body remembering a different set of walls. Memory was like that. It didn't reorganize itself just because your circumstances did. It kept its own calendar, cross-referenced with the one you were actually living, and sometimes the 2 calendars agreed and sometimes they didn't. She went back inside and built up the fire and started the coffee and listened to the cabin wake up around her. Clara's first sounds from the crate, then her standing up with a thump of small feet and the rattle of the rail, then Nora moving above in the loft with the particular creak of the 3rd board from the ladder that Lydia could identify with her eyes closed. When Caleb came in from the barn at mid-morning with 2 things, the first being a letter from his lawyer in Mill Haven, and the second being an expression she couldn't immediately read, she knew before he said anything that the news was significant. "Sit down," she said. "I'm not hurt." "I know. Sit down anyway." He sat. He put the letter on the table. She poured him coffee and sat across from him and waited. "The inquiry produced a formal finding," he said. "It was filed at the county seat yesterday. Holt's operation has been designated fraudulent in its entirety. The contracts, all of them, not just mine, not just yours, have been voided under the county ruling." He paused. "He's been ordered to appear before a circuit judge in November. The specific charges are detailed in the finding, but the short version is that he's facing criminal exposure on at least 4 counts. Lydia looked at the letter. She didn't pick it up. "How many people were in those contracts?" she asked. "The inquiry identified 11 by name. There are likely more who weren't located or didn't come forward." 11. She turned that number over. 11 women whose names had existed in a ledger the way hers had. 11 different mornings that had looked like the one she'd had in March, cold and brutal and without exit. Marjorie, she said, and Dottie. Both named, both part of the finding. He looked at his coffee. Dottie apparently provided a sworn statement in person. Rode to the county seat herself. Lydia pressed her lips together. She looked at the ceiling. She was doing the thing she'd learned to do when an emotion was real enough that it needed a moment of containment before it could be managed. Not suppressed, just held briefly at the threshold while she got her footing. "Is he going to prison?" she asked. "That's for the circuit judge. But my lawyer believes the evidence is substantial." He paused. "He won't be running that yard again regardless. The property is part of the inquiry. It'll be tied up for years." She nodded. She picked up her coffee cup. She put it down. "I want to write to Marjorie," she said. "I know, I'll get you the address. And I want to go to Millhaven when your lawyer has time. I want to sit down with him and understand exactly what the finding says. All of it, every name." She looked at Caleb directly. "I want to know who they were." He met her gaze. "All right." "Because they mattered," she said. "Before the finding and after it and regardless of what a judge decides. They were actual people and they mattered. And I have the ability to say that now from a position where someone might actually hear it, and I'm not going to not say it." She hadn't planned that speech. It had come out of somewhere below planning, and she heard it and recognized it as true and let it stand. Caleb was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I'll send a note to Millhaven today." The meeting with the lawyer happened the following week, on a Wednesday, with Nora at school, and Clara watched by a neighbor woman 2 miles down the road, a Mrs. Garrett who had been cautiously curious about the Whitlock Ranch situation since summer and had gradually, through a series of small exchanges at the Millhaven General Store, arrived at what appeared to be a genuine interest in Clara's welfare that Lydia was carefully and imperfectly learning to accept. The lawyer's office was small and organized and smelled like paper and pipe tobacco that had been present so long it had become structural. His name was Alderman, and he was a compact man in his 50s with the specific manner of someone who had spent decades translating complicated realities into language that civilians could use. He was not warm, exactly, but he was respectful, which Lydia had learned was actually rarer and more useful. He had the finding laid out on his desk. They went through it name by name. Some of the names meant nothing to her. Women she hadn't known, from places she'd never been, whose experiences she could only imagine from the shape of the documentation. Some of the names she recognized from the yard, from fragments of time, from a face seen once across a cook fire, or a voice heard through a wall. One name she knew. It was a woman named Pearl who had been at Holt's yard the winter before Lydia arrived, according to Alderman's notes. She had left before Lydia got there. She had not been located by the inquiry. "What does that mean?" Lydia asked. "Not located." Alderman paused. "It means the investigators couldn't find a current record for her. It doesn't necessarily mean—" "I understand what it doesn't necessarily mean," Lydia said. "I'm asking what it actually most likely means." A longer pause. "In cases like this, when a woman from a situation like Holt's yard can't be located through standard means, the outcomes vary widely. Some have moved and built lives that don't intersect with official records. Some are in other arrangements. Some—" He stopped. "Some didn't make it," Lydia said. "It's a possibility." She sat with that for a moment. Caleb, beside her, didn't reach for her hand or say anything. He understood that there was nothing useful to say. "If she's alive somewhere," Lydia said, "and if she ever comes looking for what happened to her, is there anything in this finding that helps her?" Alderman looked at the papers. "The finding voids all contracts associated with Holt's operation, retroactively. Any person named in those records, or who can be identified as having been subject to those arrangements, has legal standing to petition the county for recognition of the finding as it applies to their specific case." He looked at her. "In plain terms, yes. If Pearl, or anyone like her, comes forward, this document helps them." Lydia nodded. "Then I want it on record that I'm willing to be contacted by anyone connected to this case. Through you. If someone's looking for what happened, if someone needs to understand what the finding means, they can reach me." Alderman made a note. He didn't make any comment about it being unusual, which she appreciated. On the ride home from Millhaven, she and Caleb were quiet for most of the first hour. The October landscape moved around them, the grass going gold, the sky doing the thing it did in autumn, where it seemed to go deeper and further than it had in summer. "I keep thinking about Pearl," Lydia said finally. "I know. I don't even know if I ever saw her. I might have. I can't place the name." "You can't carry all of them," Caleb said. Not harshly, just as a fact. "I know that too." She looked at the road. "But I can keep a door open. That's something I can actually do." He nodded. She turned and looked at him. At the sight of his face, the familiar angles of it, the way he watched the road with the particular attention of a man who had learned that the road didn't always stay the same even when you'd been down it before. "Caleb?" He looked over. "I think I'm ready," she said. He held her gaze for a moment. "For?" "The full version," she said, "of what you said on the fence line." The wagon moved. The road went forward. A bird, maybe a mockingbird, she was getting better at identifying them, moved through the air above the tree line on the south side of the road and disappeared. Caleb looked back at the road. His jaw had the set of someone managing something they didn't want to mishandle. "You sure?" he asked. "I'm not completely sure of anything," she said. "That's how I know it's real." He was quiet for a long moment. Then, very carefully, in the way he did everything that mattered, "Then we'll figure out the rest as we go." It was not a proposal in any form a woman in a different situation might have recognized. There was no ceremony in it, no grand declaration. It was the specific, plain language of two people who had already built something together and were simply naming it. It was enough, more than enough. She turned back to face forward, and the road kept going, and the October sky sat above all of it in its deep, particular blue, and she let herself feel the full weight of where she was without bracing against it. That was new. That was the thing she would remember later, when she tried to identify the moment something changed. Not the legal victory, not the letter from Dottie, not even the finding with its 11 names. The moment was smaller than all of that. It was a Tuesday in October on a wagon seat, turning back to the road and not bracing. The wedding was in November, on a day cold enough to see your breath, but with the kind of flat, clear winter light that made everything look considered. It was not a large event. Alderman served as a witness on Caleb's side. A woman from Millhaven named Ruth, who had been Nora's first friend at school and who had extended her friendship to Lydia in the tentative, careful way of a person who had heard complicated things and decided to form her own opinion, served on Lydia's side. Nora wore her good dress and was gravely serious about it the way she was gravely serious about things that mattered to her. She held Clara's hand during the ceremony, and Clara attempted to eat part of her collar, and Nora redirected her with the long-suffering patience of a child who had been managing this particular situation for months. The ceremony itself was short. The words were civic and plain, and Lydia said her part in a voice that was clear and level, and when it was done, she felt not transformed, not suddenly different, but confirmed. Like something that had been true for a while had finally been put in language. Caleb looked at her after it was over with an expression she'd started to recognize, the one where he was moved and was not pretending not to be, which was somehow more meaningful than stoicism. "All right," he said. "All right," she said. They had dinner at a restaurant in Millhaven that had tablecloths, which Clara found endlessly fascinating and attempted to pull twice. Ruth laughed both times in a way that was genuine and didn't make Lydia feel judged, and Nora ate an entire meal with the focused intensity of a child who was never going to stop finding it remarkable that food appeared when you sat down at a table and you didn't have to earn it first. Lydia watched the two children across the table and felt the specific, almost unbearable quality of moments you know you'll want to remember while they're happening. She ate her dinner. She stayed inside the moment. She let it be real without holding it so tight it changed shape. The years moved the way years moved when the thing inside them was ordinary in the good sense, not without difficulty, not without loss, but structured around something sturdy enough to take the weight. Clara walked and then ran, and then climbed everything that could be climbed and some things that couldn't. She was loud and certain and generous, and occasionally ferocious about small injustices in the way of children who have been raised to understand that injustice is real and can be argued with. She had Lydia's eyes and, increasingly, Caleb's stubbornness, which Caleb found either funny or trying depending on how the day was going. Nora grew in the way quiet children sometimes did, sideways. You didn't notice how much until one day you looked, and the girl who had pressed herself against walls had a posture that was upright, and an opinion that she shared without being asked, and a friendship with Ruth that had become the kind of friendship that would probably last her whole life. She finished school in Millhaven at the top of her class without making any particular announcement about it, in the way she had of doing things well quietly and letting them speak for themselves. She told Lydia once, when she was 12, in the barn in the particular privacy of a large animal that had no opinions, "I don't think about before as much as I used to." Lydia was brushing the horse, which was old now and had developed strong opinions about being brushed on the left side first. She kept brushing. "Is that okay?" she asked. "I think so," Nora said. "I don't want to forget it happened, but I don't want it to be the main thing." Lydia stopped brushing and looked at her. 12 years old, with those old eyes that had gotten a little younger over the years, not much, but noticeably. "It doesn't have to be the main thing," she said. "It's part of the story. It's not the whole story." Nora considered this. "What's the main thing?" Lydia thought about it honestly. "What you do next," she said. "What you build. Who you decide to be when nobody's forcing you to be anything." Nora seemed to turn this over. Then she picked up the second brush and started on the other side of the horse, and they worked in the barn in companionable silence the way they sometimes did, and it was one of the better hours Lydia could remember. The ranch expanded in its 5th year. Not dramatically. This was not a story about sudden prosperity, about fortune arriving to reward virtue, because the world didn't work that way, and Lydia had no patience for the version of events that suggested otherwise. It was expansion in the practical sense, a second pasture, more cattle, a barn addition that Caleb and 2 hired hands built over a summer in a process that was loud and irregular and produced a structure that was functional, if not beautiful. What also expanded, gradually and without plan, was the number of people who found their way to the ranch. The first was a boy named Thomas, who was 9 when he arrived in circumstances that echoed Nora's, abandoned, afraid, marking exits. He didn't speak much for the first 3 weeks and spoke in the barn before he spoke in the cabin, which was a pattern Lydia had seen before and understood. She gave him space and proximity in the specific combination she'd learned worked. He stayed. The second was a woman named Cora, 21, who came through on a trail from the south with a child of her own and a story that she told in pieces over several days. She didn't stay. She had a sister in Colorado she was trying to reach, but she stayed for 2 weeks while the baby recovered from a respiratory illness that had scared everyone. And when she left, she took the name of Caleb's lawyer in Millhaven, written in Lydia's handwriting on a piece of paper folded 4 times. "You can't save everyone who comes through," Caleb said one evening, not critically, observationally. "I know that," Lydia said, "but you're going to try to give them something." "I'm going to give them what I have available," she said, "which is sometimes a room and sometimes a lawyer's name, and sometimes just the information that there are exits." She looked at him. "Somebody gave me exits. It cost them something, and they gave them anyway. I'm not going to forget that just because I'm past needing them." He didn't argue with this. He had never been under the impression that he was going to argue her out of it, which was one of the things she valued most about him. The specific intelligence of knowing when a position was not negotiable and not spending yourself fighting it. The third person who came was not a child and not someone passing through. She was Marjorie, who had written the second letter to Caleb's lawyer, who ran the freight operation in Ferris with her husband, who had been at Holt's yard for 14 months before she got out. She came to visit on a clear day in the ranch's 4th year with her 2 children and her husband, a broad-shouldered, quiet man named Ellis, and she and Lydia sat on the repaired porch for 3 hours while the children played in the yard and Ellis and Caleb talked cattle in the barn. They didn't talk about Holt, or the inquiry, or the finding, except briefly, at the end. Most of what they talked about was ordinary. Marjorie's freight business, Lydia's garden that had started producing in the 3rd year, The specific challenges of raising children on land that was still figuring itself out. They talked about their children's faces. They talked about the ways winter was different from what either of them had expected it to be. At some point, Marjorie said, without much preamble, "I spent a long time thinking the thing that happened to me was the most true thing about me." Lydia understood this with her entire body. "How did you stop?" she asked. Marjorie looked at the yard where her daughter was teaching Clara a clapping game with the patience of an older child. "I didn't stop entirely," she said, "but I started noticing there were other true things, and gradually the other true things took up more space." She paused. Ellis helped with that, having somebody who just kept adding more true things. Lydia thought about fence posts and cornbread and a hammer on a cold morning and the sound of a man on the floor near the fire, not stirring so she could sleep. "Yes," she said. The afternoon went long, and Marjorie and Ellis and their children stayed for dinner, and it was loud in the cabin in the way it got when the head count exceeded what the table was designed for, and Clara sat on Caleb's knee because there weren't enough chairs, and Thomas ate 3 helpings of stew with the focused gratitude of a child who hadn't been sure, for the first years of his life, that there would be another meal after this one. When they left, Marjorie hugged Lydia at the fence, which was not something either of them had planned. It lasted a beat longer than a polite goodbye hug. It was the kind of hug people gave each other when they shared knowledge that couldn't be fully spoken. "I'll write more often," Marjorie said. "So will I," Lydia said. She watched the wagon go down the track and turn onto the road south and disappear behind the tree line, and then she stood in the yard for a while in the way she sometimes did, not doing anything, not thinking anything in particular, just being present in the specific place she was. The ranch was still not prosperous in any extravagant sense. The porch was solid now on both sides, which remained a point of quiet satisfaction. The chicken coop had not lost a bird in 2 years. The south window in the loft, which had been Nora's, was now Thomas's. And Nora had a room in the main level addition that Caleb had built in the second year, and that she had furnished with the particular precision of a person who had never had a space entirely their own and was taking the responsibility seriously. The barn was larger than it had been. The cattle were healthy. Holt had gone before the circuit judge in the November following the inquiry and had received a sentence that involved fines and restrictions and the permanent dissolution of his operation, which was not everything Lydia might have wanted, but was more than she had initially believed was possible. His name came up occasionally in legal correspondence, diminishing in significance with each mention, becoming slowly just another entry in a document somewhere. She did not spend much time thinking about him. This was a choice she'd made, not a passive outcome. She had actively decided that the amount of space he occupied in her interior life was something she had some control over, and she had been reducing it incrementally for years, and it was working. He was not gone from her history, but he was not the author of it. He was something that had happened, and she had happened after it, and the after was considerably longer and more textured than the during, and it was still going. Warren Holt had believed that he could set the terms of what Lydia was and what she was worth. He had been wrong, specifically because he had misunderstood the nature of the thing he thought he was evaluating. He'd looked at a 19-year-old woman on a platform in a cattle yard and seen a price. He'd missed the part that was irreducible, the part that was already working the problem, already looking for the exit, already holding a baby against her chest and standing straighter when they looked at her. You couldn't put a price on that part. You could suppress it for a while. You couldn't make it not exist. Pearl was found, in the end, not by the county inquiry, by a circuitous series of letters that Lydia had been writing for 4 years, following whatever threads existed, reaching out through aldermen's contacts to anyone who might have information. Pearl had moved north to Kansas, and then further north, and had been living under a different name for 6 years by the time the letter from alderman's office found her. She had 2 children of her own. She was alive. She wrote back a letter that was 2 sentences long. "I didn't expect anyone to look. Thank you for looking." Lydia kept that letter in the box under the bed where she kept the things that mattered most. Clara's first shoe, which was embarrassingly small, a drawing Nora had made in her 3rd year of school that Lydia had removed from the Millhaven classroom wall when Nora had decided she was done with it and didn't want it thrown away. The receipt from Caleb's transaction that had been filed with the county and was now legally significant, and also the document that had changed the direction of her life. 2 sentences from Pearl. She kept them with the rest. Dottie visited the ranch once, in the 5th year, making a trip from the town she'd settled in with the specific determination of a woman who has decided something is going to happen and arranged accordingly. She was older than Lydia remembered, or rather, Lydia hadn't been in a condition to take in details the last time she'd seen her, in the barn stall on that March morning. She was 60s, with gray hair and a direct manner, and a way of looking at the cabin and the yard and the children that contained all of her own feelings without expressing them unnecessarily. She stayed for 4 days. On the 2nd evening, she and Lydia sat on the porch after the children were in bed and the night had come down cold and clear. Caleb was inside, giving them the space that he was always good at giving when it was needed, appearing only to bring out 2 cups of coffee and then disappearing again without remark. "You've done well," Dottie said. "I've had help," Lydia said. "Everybody has help. Not everybody uses it right." She drank her coffee. "You built something." "We built something." Dottie looked at the yard. The cattle were quiet in the pasture. The stars were doing their work above the Texas hills, with the particular indifference of things that had been at their work for longer than human trouble and would be at it long after. "I've thought about that morning more times than I can count," Dottie said. "The barn? Whether I did enough." "You did everything you could do," Lydia said. "It wasn't enough at the time." "No," Lydia agreed, "but it was something, and something was what got me to the next thing, and the next thing got me here." She looked at the yard. "I've thought about chains a lot over the years, what holds people in them and what breaks them. And I've come to believe it's never one thing. It's a series of small things. You were one of mine." Dottie was quiet for a long moment. "I laid my apron down," she said finally. "That's all." "That's everything," Lydia said. The silence that followed was the good kind, the kind 2 people fell into when they'd said what was true and didn't need to add to it. They sat on the porch until the cold drove them inside, and then they went inside and went to bed. And in the morning, Dottie was up before Lydia and had coffee on and was talking to Thomas at the table about his school in Mill Haven in the manner of a woman who had always been good at drawing children out, which is to say, she wasn't drawing him out at all, she was just talking to him, which was a different thing and more effective. Here's what Lydia knew by the time she was 26 that she had not known at 19. The story you're inside of is never the whole story. The cattle yard was not the whole story. The auction platform was not the whole story. The rope around her wrist was not the whole story. These things were chapters in something larger, and the length of a chapter is not fixed in advance, and the chapter that contains the worst things is not the chapter the story is about. She knew something else, too. She'd been afraid for a long time that she wasn't the kind of person who could have what she had. Not because she didn't deserve it. She'd let go of the framework of deserving, and not deserving some time in the 2nd year because that framework was a trap, but because she'd been so thoroughly arranged into a person who could only receive, who could only be acted upon, that being the one who acted had felt like putting on clothes that belonged to someone else. It didn't feel that way anymore. She had hammered fence posts. She had stood on a porch and told a powerful man to get back on his horse. She had written letters and kept a door open and taken in a boy who didn't speak, and stayed up nights when the cough that Clara brought home from somewhere turned bad enough to frighten everyone. She had built, not perfectly, not without stumbling, not without the nights when the old dark came back and sat on her chest, but she had built, with her own hands, in her own name. The girl who had signed a document at 15 without understanding it had become a woman who understood every document she signed and had opinions about its language. That was not a small thing. It was, in some ways, the whole thing. On the morning of her 26th birthday, which was in late March and came in cold the way March always did, she stood at the window of the cabin before anyone else was up and looked out at the yard. The frost was on the fence rails again. The cattle were moving. The barn sat solid at the south edge of the clearing with the light not yet come up enough to give it its full dimension, just a shape, reliable and present. Somewhere inside the cabin, a child moved in sleep, and the board settled, and the fire she'd built up an hour ago was doing its work on the chill. She had been in this yard through 2 winters. She knew the sounds of it. She knew which cattle moved early and which moved late, which post on the east fence still sometimes needed attention after a hard rain, which board in the porch floor was going to need replacement by spring. She knew the crack of the barn door when the wind was from the north, and the specific silence of the pasture just before the animals decided to start moving, and the way the light on the hills to the west in the late afternoon looked different in summer than in fall, in ways that she had stopped trying to describe and had just started watching. She had been sold for $200. She was thinking about this not with the specific named pain she'd carried for years, but with the particular clarity of someone who can look at the past without being inside it. The $200 was a fact. What it had meant about her value was a lie, and the lie had belonged entirely to the man who told it, and he was now a series of court documents in a county seat office, diminishing in significance year by year. She was not what had happened to her. She was what she had done after. Caleb came up behind her. She heard the particular quiet of his footsteps on the boards, had long since learned to hear him coming even when he was trying not to wake anyone, and he stood behind her looking out the same window. "Cold morning," he said. "Yes." "Clara will be unbearable about it." "Yes." She almost smiled. "She won't wear the coat. We've been through this." "We'll go through it again." He put his hand on her shoulder briefly, the way he sometimes did when he was close and didn't feel the need to make a thing of it. And she put her hand over his, and they stood at the window looking out at the frost and the yard and the particular ordinary morning that was theirs. She had learned, in the years since that March morning when she'd walked through a gate for the last time, that freedom was not a door you went through once and arrived on the other side permanently different. It was a practice. It was a daily decision, sometimes small and sometimes enormous, to be the one who chose. What she said, what she built, who she opened the door to, what she protected, how much space she gave to the parts of the past that wanted all of it. She was not free of everything. She was not done with the nightmares entirely, though they were infrequent now and short. She was not finished with grief or with the specific loneliness of knowing there were women like Pearl scattered across the country who hadn't found their letters yet. She was not a person who had been made whole by love, because she had come to believe that no one made you whole. You built wholeness, yourself, with the materials available, and love was a material, a good one, but it was not the architect. She was the architect. She was imperfect, occasionally short-tempered, still prone to holding things too close to herself when she should have spoken. She made mistakes with the children. She pushed Thomas toward independence too fast, once, and had to sit with the damage of that for weeks before they found their way back. She and Caleb argued sometimes about real things, not the small surface arguments of people testing each other, but the harder kind, about the ranch and the children and what they each needed from the arrangement that the other one wasn't giving. They worked through these by working through them, which was unglamorous and necessary, and always left them clear on the other side. She was building a life, not a finished one, a building one. From the back of the cabin, Clara's voice rose in its morning register, loud and certain, announcing the day. The board on the loft ladder creaked, which meant Nora was already up. Thomas would be down in 20 minutes, which was how long it took him to decide that, yes, the morning was real and it was safe to enter it. Caleb moved toward the stove to start the coffee. Lydia stayed at the window a moment longer. The sun was coming up behind the eastern hills, not dramatic, just gradually present, filling in the colors of the yard the way the day always did. Brown and gold, and the particular deep green of the pasture grass that was already coming back, even in late March, already deciding that winter was done. She watched it. Then she turned and went to help with breakfast, and the day began the way good days began. Not perfectly, not without friction, but forward and warm and real and hers. She was imperfect, occasionally short-tempered, still prone to holding things too close to herself when she should have spoken. She made mistakes with the children. She pushed Thomas toward independence too fast once and had to sit with the damage of that for weeks before they found their way back. She and Caleb argued sometimes about real things, not the small surface arguments of people testing each other, but the harder kind, about the ranch and the children and what they each needed from the arrangement that the other one wasn't giving. They worked through these by working through them, which was unglamorous and necessary, and always left them clearer on the other side. She was building a life, not a finished one, a building one. From the back of the cabin, Claire's voice rose in its morning register, loud and certain, announcing the day. The board on the loft ladder creaked, which meant Nora was already up. Thomas would be down in 20 minutes, which was how long it took him to decide that yes, the morning was real and it was safe to enter it. Caleb moved toward the stove to start the coffee. Lydia stayed at the window a moment longer. The sun was coming up behind the eastern hills, not dramatic, just gradually present, filling in the colors of the yard the way the day always did. Brown and gold and the particular deep green of the pasture grass that was already coming back, even in late March, already deciding that winter was done. She watched it. Then she turned and went to help with breakfast, and the day began the way good days began. Not perfectly, not without friction, but forward and warm and real and hers.